Buckle up, truth seekers, for a chilling dive into a forgotten corner of American history, where the line between love and obsession blurs into something truly sinister. In the heart of Georgia's shadowy swamps, a tale unfolds that's as haunting as it is heartbreaking. This is no ordinary ghost story. It's a descent into a world of control, deception, and a darkness that lingers like mist over the bayou. Welcome to a story that history tried to bury, but we're digging it up today. Let's get started. In 1852, in the sweltering, fog-laden haze of southern Georgia, a young girl who had long forgotten the timbre of her own words stood atop a wooden platform at auction, unwanted by all. They dubbed her the mute orphan, perhaps 9, perhaps 11 years old, with eyes that mirrored the stormy gray of a fading dusk. Eyes that observed all yet revealed nothing. She was the final remnant of a bankrupt farm's holdings, an overlooked scrap of humanity. The auctioneer, drenched in sweat through his cotton shirt, hawked her qualities. "Sturdy for her frame," he shouted, and hushed. "She'll cause you no fuss." But to the farmers and their spouses, the quiet wasn't a boon. It was a flaw. It carried an air of condemnation, a hex. Offers were scant, derisive. $7 for. A fellow in the rear bid $2, chuckling as he did. The girl remained immobile, a specter under the harsh midday glare. Her composure a peculiar, disquieting defiance. Then a wagon hatch swung wide. A lady stepped forth, gliding through the throng, with an elegance that parted them instinctively. She was Eleanor Hawthorne, spouse of the secluded cotton baron Theodore Hawthorne. She was a myth in the county, a fragile figurine of a lady seldom glimpsed, around whom dreadful rumors swirled like marsh mist. She halted at the platform's base, her stare fastening on the voiceless child. The auctioneer faltered, his bluster evaporated. "Mrs. Hawthorne." She lifted a lone gloved palm, muting him. Her tone, when it emerged, was a crisp, startling chill amid the warmth. "That is no servant," she declared, her statement resonating over the hushed astonishment of the assembly. "That is Amelia, my child, the one we interred 6 years past." The trek to Hawthorne Estate was a plunge into a realm of verdant gloom and oppressive quiet. The girl, now termed Amelia by Eleanor, sat facing the woman in the plush-upholstered wagon. She avoided her gaze. Instead, she observed the landscape blur into a smear of oak roots and drooping kudzu that resembled the ashen, matted locks of submerged souls. Eleanor uttered nothing for leagues. She merely scrutinized the girl with a fervor that resembled less affectionate motherhood and more a scholar examining a scarce affixed moth. Can you picture it? To be snatched from one ordeal merely to enter the cushioned confines of another, propelled by a lady who regards you not as an individual, but as an endeavor, as a substitute. The atmosphere in the wagon was dense with the aroma of jasmine and something additional. Something sharp and faintly remedial, like aged ailment. The wheels grated on a secluded path, and the woods enveloped them, the foliage so dense it pilfered the daylight, submerging them in an early twilight. This was the Hawthorne domain, less a farm, and more a realm apart, barricaded by the wild's apathy. When the estate at last materialized amid the trees, it was not the majestic pillared residence she might have anticipated. It was a somber gem of a structure, crafted from dark oak timber that appeared to absorb the illumination, with panes like empty gazing orbs. Theodore Hawthorne, the lord of the dwelling, was absent to welcome them. Solely the structure awaited, mute and anticipatory, as though it had foreseen the advent of a phantom. And as Eleanor escorted the girl from the wagon, her clasp on her limb was not tender. It was proprietary. It was the hold of an artisan asserting her medium. "Welcome home, Amelia," she murmured, and the title felt like the initial twist of a latch in a bolt. Within Hawthorne Estate lay a gallery of sorrow. Each plane was buffed to a reflective gleam. Each timepiece halted at the precise same hour, 4:28. The atmosphere was stagnant and chill, bearing the odor of grime and withered blooms. Eleanor guided the voiceless girl up a curving, unilluminated stairway, her shoes tapping like the deliberate cadence of a grave beetle. They bypassed the staff's lodgings, a confined loft or a moist basement. They proceeded to a chamber in the primary section of the abode, a chamber whose entrance was etched with a solitary, ornate A. "This was your chamber," Eleanor stated, her tone gentle yet resolute, permitting no dispute. "It is your chamber once more." She thrust the portal ajar, unveiling a space that was not a youth sleeping quarters, but a sanctuary. A draped berth swathed in soft blue satin, a ceramic figurine assortment with glassy, unwavering stares, a swaying pony paused in mid-stride. All was impeccable, overly so. There was no grime, no trace of the 6 years that had allegedly transpired. It was as if a youth had merely departed briefly and would return imminently. Eleanor directed her to the dressing table, where a silver-handled comb rested beside a melody container. "Do you recall this, Amelia?" she whispered, her countenance near the girl's in the reflection. "You adored its tune." The girl gazed at her own likeness, an unfamiliar visage with broad, horrified eyes, a visage that did not fit here. She uttered nothing. Her quiet, once a barrier, was now evolving into a confinement. Eleanor's grin failed to touch her eyes. "You're weary from your extended voyage back to us. We will address your recollection tomorrow. We will address your speech." She departed, securing the portal from without. The snap of the bolt reverberated in the mute, flawless chamber. The girl was solitary with the specter she was meant to embody. You're not supposed to know this, but the murmurs in the county about Amelia Hawthorne's demise never fully subsided. They were like agitated sediment in the creek, ever turbid, ever altering. The formal account was infection, a rapid, pitiless malady that claimed the child in the dark hours. The family healer endorsed the document, and a modest ivory coffin was entombed in the family plot. But the attendants, those dismissed soon after, they narrated a divergent tale in subdued, frightened whispers. They claimed there was no infection. They recounted a tempest that evening, a ferocious one that stripped tiles from the roof and resounded like the heavens rending. They recounted yells from inside the estate, a child's shriek abruptly silenced, trailed by a mother's wail that, as one KitchenAid described, didn't resemble any mourning I'd ever heard. It resembled victory. And then there was the old local folklore, the one the elders shared with their young to deter them from straying too deep into the oak groves. They said the marsh has a recollection. They say it occasionally claims things. A wandering calf, a misplaced trapper, a wayward youth. But they also say the marsh is envious. It dislikes retaining what isn't its. Eventually, the legend states, the marsh returns what it claims. Always altered, always distinct, always erroneous. When Eleanor Hawthorne entered that labor market and asserted a voiceless, bewildered girl as her own revived offspring, the veterans in the county merely nodded gradually. They weren't astonished. They had been anticipating because they knew the narrative wasn't concluded. The marsh had returned something. The initial instruction commenced at daybreak. Eleanor accessed the chamber bearing a compact hidebound reader, the sort employed to instruct youths their alphabet. She didn't appear irate. She appeared tranquil, like a tolerant instructor, prepared to initiate a challenging but essential duty. She seated herself in a satin seat across from the girl who was balanced on the rim of the silken berth, having not slumbered an instant. "Good morning, Amelia," Eleanor said, her voice smooth as creek pebble. The girl did not reply, her eyes fastened on the ceramic figurines gazing from their ledge. "Today," Eleanor persisted unswayed, "we will rehearse your name. It is the primary step to reclaiming yourself. When I say Amelia, you will regard me. Can you do that?" She waited. The girl stayed utterly motionless, her petite form stiff with focus that was nearly imperceptible. This was the core of the enigma, wasn't it? Her quiet. Was it the outcome of a wound so profound that it had pilfered her speech? Was it a tenacious, mute deed of resistance against a realm that had solely wounded her? Or was it something else entirely? A wisdom, a mystery she bore that could not be expressed in terms. "Amelia," Eleanor reiterated, a shard of frost infiltrating her timbre. The girl's glance darted towards the pane, towards the ashen glow sifting through the kudzu-draped oaks. Eleanor's grin constricted. "Perhaps you require incentive." She approached the figurine ledge and selected the grandest, most exquisite one, a figurine in an ivory lace gown. "You cherished this one above all. You named her Daisy." She extended the figurine. Say your name, Amelia, and you can clasp her. The quiet in the chamber became a vital entity, a third entity, weighty and stifling. The girl's palms were balled into minuscule fists in her lap. After an extended instant, Eleanor's demeanor shifted. The facade of the tolerant parent slid, and for a moment, the girl glimpsed the horrifying fixation below. With an abrupt, fierce snap, Eleanor wrenched the figurine's ceramic crown until it fractured off, discarding the torso and crown to the ground. "We will attempt again tomorrow," she said, her tone impeccably composed once more. "We have all the time in the world." She encountered the lord of the dwelling on the fourth day. Theodore Hawthorne was a phantom in his own residence, a gentleman who appeared to linger at the fringes of spaces, never wholly accessing them. The girl observed him in the study, a lofty, emaciated silhouette encircled by towering racks of volumes, a tumbler of golden fluid quivering in his grasp. He glanced up, and his eyes, the same stormy gray as the genuine Amelia's must have been, expanded in what appeared like unadulterated dread. He didn't perceive a girl. He perceived a specter. He retreated a partial step, toppling a pile of documents, and escaped the space without a syllable. His apprehension was a stark opposition to his spouse's frigid, computed fixation. If Eleanor perceived a venture, an opportunity at revival, Theodore perceived an atrocity, an unpardonable blasphemy. That evening she overheard them disputing through the dense oak partitions. His tone was a subdued, frantic grumble. Hers was a keen, sibilant whisper. "Cannot persist this pretense, Eleanor. She is not her. She is whatever I declare she is. She is a container awaiting fulfillment. You forfeited your belief, Theodore. I did not. This isn't belief. It's lunacy. Look at the child. She's petrified." "She is unshaped," Eleanor whispered back, her tone laced with a chilling assurance. "She is a vacant sheet upon which I will inscribe our daughter's title. You are too feeble to manage the initial one's flaws. You will not meddle with my rectification of the subsequent." There was a noise of fracturing crystal, then a ponderous, vanquished quiet. Thereafter, Theodore appeared to diminish even more into the backdrop. He consumed his repasts solitary. He strolled the ground solely at dark. He regarded the girl not with brutality, but with a deep, mournful evasion, as if her mere existence was a fount of intolerable agony. He was a captive in his own residence, bound by a sorrow his spouse had contorted into a grotesque novel form, and the girl, ensnared between the spouse's fixation and the husband's dread, commenced to comprehend that she wasn't in a domicile. She was in a pen with two guardians, both of them deranged in their own distinctive manner. Liberty, she soon discerned, was a meticulously gauged mirage. Each midday, for precisely 90 minutes, Eleanor would unbolt her portal and permit her to reacquaint herself with the abode. But it was an examination, not a boon. Eleanor would observe from the obscurity of a corridor, her eyes tracing the girl's every gesture, hunting for a glimmer of familiarity, an indication that Amelia's specter was rousing within this fresh form. The girl traversed the mute chill spaces with cautious, calibrated strides. The abode felt like it was suspending its respiration. She traced her digits over a majestic harpsichord, its levers faded and mute. She gazed at a kin portrait above the hearth, Theodore, a youthful, happier Eleanor, and a young girl with luminous, rebellious eyes, and a grin that didn't entirely align with her parents' grave countenances. This was the authentic Amelia. She resembled a girl who would have generated clamor, a girl who would have chortled too boisterously, who would have resisted. Nothing akin to the voiceless container Eleanor was attempting to forge. In the study, concealed behind a slackboard in the paneling that she discovered by sheer fortune, she unearthed it. A petite satin-bound journal secured with a dulled copper latch. It felt frigid to the contact. It was Amelia's. The title was imprinted in waning silver on the casing. This was a fragment of the genuine girl, a mystery that had endured the cleanse, the meticulous preservation of Eleanor's sorrow. She concealed it into the band of her plain frock, her pulse thundering against her cage. This was perilous. This was insight. And in an abode constructed on a bedrock of mysteries and deceptions, insight was the most perilous thing of all. She didn't know how she would access it, but she knew she must. She must discern who this specter was that she was supposed to be. Not for Eleanor's benefit, but for her own. To uncover what transpired to the girl in the portrait with the rebellious eyes. Let's halt for an instant and contemplate the realm they inhabited. A quotation from an 1849 health treatise by Dr. Elias Whitaker, a notable healer of the era, casts a chilling illumination on Eleanor's approaches. He penned, "The feminine intellect in its innate condition is susceptible to bouts of frenzy and sentimental surplus. Mutism, especially in the youthful, is frequently not a consequence of bodily affliction, but of an ethical shortcoming, an obstinacy of the spirit. The healer's obligation is not to pamper such conduct, but to shatter the resolve that upholds it. Through seclusion, through the elimination of amenities, through an organized and inflexible re-instruction of the faculties, the mute tongue can be compelled to articulate. The remedy is not discovered in remedy, but in dominance." Can you detect Eleanor's tone in those terms? An obstinacy of the spirit. Shatter the resolve that upholds it. She wasn't merely a bereaved parent adrift in illusion. She was a lady of her epoch, equipped with the harsh pseudo-scientific dialect of command. She perceived the girl's quiet, not as a manifestation of wound, but as a defect to be amended, an impurity to be scorched away. Her instructions, her chastisements, her unyielding mental strain. In her intellect, this wasn't savagery. It was therapy. It was a virtuous empirical pursuit to reinstate what was fractured. She was the healer of her daughter's essence, and the estate was her surgical chamber. This wasn't just a spectral abode narrative. It was a narrative of a health operation, and the subject was bound to the slab, incapable to shriek. The initial genuine chastisement arrived a fortnight after her advent. It wasn't for a vocal infringement, but for a mute one. During one of their recollection sessions, Eleanor had been displaying the girl an assortment of Amelia's preserved blossoms, labeling each one. "This is a goldenrod. You gathered it by the brook. Can you say goldenrod, Amelia?" The girl had stayed expressionless, her stare affixed on a moisture blemish on the roof that resembled a howling countenance. Eleanor's forbearance, always a slender overlay over a nucleus of iron, ultimately fractured. She didn't yell. She didn't smite her. Her deeds were far more horrifying. She merely seized the girl by the limb and escorted her down to the estate's storage vault. The atmosphere grew chill and humid, dense with the scent of soil and decay. It was a modest stone-enclosed space, utterly obscure when the sturdy pine portal was closed. "Obstinate things must be instructed where they pertain," Eleanor said, her tone resounding in the cramped area. "In the obscurity, in the hush, where they can ponder their own void. When you are prepared to be Amelia, you will summon me. I will be attentive." Then the portal thundered shut, and the gloom was total. It was a tangible entity compressing in on her, saturating her ears with the noise of her own frenzied pulse. Hours merged into one another. The chill infiltrated her frame. She didn't exclaim. She didn't pound on the portal. She withdrew into the sole locale she possessed, the voiceless, barricaded stronghold of her own intellect. Late that evening, or perhaps the following day, she wasn't certain, the portal groaned open. A sliver of torch glow sliced through the ebony. Eleanor stood there, an outline of dreadful poise. "Have you discovered your speech, my dear?" she inquired. The girl quivering on the moist floor just gazed. Eleanor exhaled, a noise of staged disillusionment. "Very well, another day." Then the portal thundered shut again. The gloom re-emerged. It was then the girl comprehended. This wasn't about compelling her to articulate. It was about fracturing her. It was about evacuating her utterly, so that Eleanor could infuse the specter of Amelia within. In an abode this mute, you learn to heed other things. The groan of a plank, the murmur of the breeze, the dialect of gazes. There were other attendants, but they shifted like phantoms, their countenances meticulously neutral, their forms curved in a perpetual flinch of apprehension. They were prohibited from addressing her, a decree imposed by Eleanor's perpetually vigilant existence. But one of them, an elderly lady named Mabel, who labored in the kitchen, discovered a method. Mabel's palms were knotted with joint pain. but her eyes were keen and lucid. One dusk, as the girl was being guided back to her chamber after an unproductive session, Mabel was buffing cutlery in the passage. As Eleanor passed, Mabel kept her crown down, her palms shifting rhythmically. But as the girl passed, the old lady's eyes darted up for just an instant. It was a glance that encompassed a universe of significance. It was a glance of compassion and of caution. The next day, it occurred again. The girl was left solitary in the dining space for a moment, and Mabel entered to clear the board. The old lady shifted with practiced sluggishness. As she reached for a dish near the girl, she inadvertently toppled a utensil to the ground. As she stooped to recover it, her back to the corridor, she murmured a solitary term. Her tone a arid rustle of foliage. Flee. It was regional. Before the girl could respond, Mabel had erect, her countenance once again an impassive facade, and departed the space. It was the initial deed of benevolence, the initial fissure in the barrier of seclusion she had encountered since arriving. But it was also frightening. What did Mabel know? What had she witnessed? The old lady's murmured term affirmed the girl's profoundest fear. This was not a locale you could be rescued from. It was a locale you had to evade. Mabel's caution was not just counsel. It was a foretelling. Flee or you will be devoured. Eleanor resolved that the girl's intellect was not the sole thing that required shaping. If she would not articulate like Amelia, she would be compelled to move like her. A fresh instructor was summoned to the estate. He was not a scholar of literature, but a severe ashen etiquette coach from Atlanta named Mr. Sinclair. He focused in instructing the offspring of the affluent the subtler aspects of stance, demeanor, and decorum. He arrived thrice a week, his countenance a perpetual mask of censure. The sessions occurred in the expansive salon, a vast chill space where the furnishings was shrouded in ivory linens like an assembly of specters. Eleanor would sit in a tall-backed seat, observing every instant. The sessions were a form of torment. Mr. Sinclair would compel the girl to ambulate for hours with a volume equilibrated on her crown. He would employ a slender, elongated rod to wrap her backbone if she hunched, her shoulders if she stiffened. Elegance, young miss, is the absence of contemplation, he would intone. The form must learn to comply without consulting the intellect. Then came the melody. He would seat at the majestic harpsichord, its levers unveiled for the initial time, and perform the basic exercises that Amelia had once rehearsed. He would attempt to direct the girl's petite, rigid digits over the levers. She possessed a delicate contact, Eleanor would remark from her seat. Like a butterfly's wings, your contact is ponderous, like rock. The girl withstood it all in her deep quiet. She equilibrated the volume. She endured the rap of the rod. She permitted him to maneuver her numb sensing digits over the ebony levers. But she was acquiring. She was observing Eleanor during these sessions, perceiving the glimmer of contentment in her eyes when she maintained a stance accurately, the burst of ire when her digit struck an erroneous note. She was acquiring what the authentic Amelia had been, fragment by agonizing fragment. She was being presented the schematic of the specter she was intended to incarnate. And she realized with a chill terror that the superior she became at this enactment, the nearer she was to her own obliteration. One dusk, after a particularly arduous session with Mr. Sinclair, Eleanor left her in the salon to rehearse her stance. The sun was descending, and elongated, distorted shadows extended across the buffed floor. The space was bordered with lofty, ornamented reflectors, now hazy with antiquity. The girl stood in the midst of the vast vacant area, encircled by the veiled furnishings. She captured her likeness in one of the reflectors. At first, it was merely her own countenance, pallid and slender, her eyes broad and obscure, but she maintained her stare, and for a horrifying, pulse-halting instant, the likeness oscillated. It altered. The countenance gazing back at her was no longer her own. The eyes were distinct, still gray but brighter, angrier. The lips were fixed in a sulky line. The tresses seemed to coil differently at the brows. It was the girl from the portrait. It was Amelia. The likeness grinned, a chill, harsh, petite grin that didn't touch the rebellious eyes. The girl lurched back, her respiration snagging in her throat. She blinked, and the image was vanished. It was just her again, her own petrified countenance gazing back. Was she forfeiting her sanity? Was Eleanor's unyielding strain ultimately fracturing her, causing her to perceive the specter her oppressor was so desperate to summon? Or was it something else? A caution from the abode itself, a recollection ensnared in the argent of the reflector. She retreated from the reflector, her pulse pounding a frenzied cadence against her cage. She was becoming detached from herself, her own persona dissolving like salt in liquid. The boundary between who she was and who she was supposed to be was obscuring. And in that instant, she dreaded the quiet inside her might not be vacant after all. She dreaded something might actually be commencing to awaken. That evening, she knew she couldn't linger any longer. The apparition in the reflector had frightened her into deed. While the abode was deep in the clutches of its nocturnal quiet, she labored on the petite copper latch of the journal. Employing a hairpin she'd painstakingly loosened from her own firmly bound tresses, she explored the minuscule apparatus. It felt futile at first, but she was forbearing. She had learned forbearance in the vault. After what felt like 90 minutes, there was a faint snap. The latch sprang ajar, her palms quivering. She accessed the satin-covered tome. The initial few folios were what you'd anticipate from a girl of 9. Youthful script, simple observations about her cult, her sessions, her aversion of embroidery. But as she perused on, the timbre began to alter. The records grew briefer, more agitated. The penmanship became a spindly scribble. She inscribed about her mother. "Mama says I am a letdown. She says my essence is rough. She administered me the remedy again today. It makes the realm swirl and my crown feel full of wool." The girl's vital fluid ran chill. The remedy is Eleanor's remedial scent. Then the journal started to reference a covert locale. "I go to the locale where the marble seraphs sob when Mama is irate. She does not know about it. It is my sole mystery." And then the records became truly unsettling. She ceased inscribing about her mother and started inscribing about someone else. "The phantom figure comes to my pain at dark. Mama says he is a vision, but he is not. He murmurs my title. He says he can convey me away from the remedy and the sessions. He says he has a locale for girls like me, a phantom figure." Was this a youth's fancy? A means to manage with the mental mistreatment she was enduring? Or was there another entity in this abode? Another mystery even murkier than Eleanor's fixation? The ultimate record was tear-marred, the pigment smudged in spots. The phantom figure is irate. Mama discovered my covert locale. He says I have to depart tonight. He is awaiting for me by the sobbing seraphs. That was the concluding thing inscribed. The remainder of the folios were vacant. The regional terms Mabel had murmured, flee, assumed a fresh and dreadful urgency. The girl began to comprehend that she was not just battling for her persona. She was battling for her existence. A few days later, she found her opportunity to address the old lady again, or rather, to heed. Eleanor and Theodore had embarked on a scarce excursion to the nearby county for provisions, leaving the abode under the vigilance of a harsh, taciturn supervisor, who mostly remained inebriated in his hut. The girl simulated a belly pain to evade her demeanor rehearsal, and made her way to the vaporous warmth of the detached galley structure. Mabel was shaping batter, her dusky limbs dusted with meal. She didn't glance up when the girl accessed, but she knew she was there. "You should not be here, little phantom," she murmured, her tone subdued. The girl stood mutely by the portal, extending the petite latched journal. Mabel glanced at it, and a profound exhale shuddered through her form. "I knew that youth had mysteries," she said, her eyes melancholic. She had a blaze in her, that one, not like the others. The girl's crown snapped up. "Others?" Mabel seemed to realize what she had uttered. She began to labor the batter faster, her knuckles pale. "Before you," she whispered, her back still to the girl. "There were others. Not for long. One was a girl from a passing caravan. Guardians perished of plague. Endured a fortnight. Another was acquired like you, but she wept constantly. The lady does not like weepers. What transpired to them? The girl's own tone in her crown was a desperate shriek. Mabel halted shaping. She pivoted, wiping her palms on her smock, and for the initial time she regarded directly at the girl, her stare full of a dreadful archaic grief. What occurs to a defective figurine in an abode of flawless things? They get stored away. They get returned to the container. You do not weep. You do not converse. That is why you have endured this long. But do not think it will preserve you. Nothing will. Now depart, before he returns. Mabel pivoted back to her batter, and the dialogue was concluded. The girl escaped, her intellect reeling. She was not the initial substitute. She was just the newest in a sequence of unsuccessful trials. Eleanor's venture intensified. Her forbearance, already eroded by the girl's persistent quiet, was dissipating. The sessions became less about instructing and more about a peculiar ceremonial metamorphosis. One dawn, Eleanor came to the chamber with an armload of garments. They were Amelia's frocks, conserved in pine and jasmine. They were fashioned of fine muslin and satin, utterly dissimilar from the plain linen garment the girl had been donning. "It is time you commenced to appear the role," Eleanor said, her tone fragile. She compelled the girl to disrobe and attired her in one of the frocks. The material felt foreign against her epidermis, the minuscule ivory fasteners chill. It was like donning a deceased person's epidermis. Then came the tresses. Eleanor seated her at the dressing table and commenced to comb her obscure linear tresses with fierce, chastising strokes. She attempted to compel it into the gentle spirals that Amelia had in the portrait, employing hot irons that hissed perilously near to the girl's scalp. The odor of singed tresses filled the space. "Her tresses was like woven starlight," Eleanor murmured, more to herself than to the girl. "Yours is so coarse, so shadowy. We will have to improvise." She bound it with an azure satin bow, tugging it so taut it made the girl's eyes moisten. She then retreated to admire her labor. In the reflector, the girl perceived a grotesque caricature, a voiceless, dark-tressed youth engulfed by the ruffled pastel attire of a deceased girl. The contrast was horrifying. It generated an effect of profound erroneousness, something so disquieting it was hard to regard. This is what they term the Eerie chasm, the juncture where something appears nearly mortal, but a vital component is awry, rendering it repulsive. The girl had become a living exemplar of it. She was Eleanor's figurine, attired and fashioned, but her eyes, her mute, observant, petrified eyes, betrayed it all. They were the one portion of her Eleanor couldn't alter, the one portion that screamed the verity. The abode itself seemed to be recollecting. Or perhaps the girl's intellect, under such immense strain, was commencing to splinter and perceive things that weren't there. One midday, as she stood in the upper passage, the realm tilted. The illumination from the pane dimmed. The atmosphere grew ponderous and charged, and the noise of precipitation, a deluge, abruptly filled her ears, even though the firmament outside was lucid and azure. The noise was so authentic, so immediate, and with it came tones, not murmurs, but shouts resounding from below. Theodore's tone raw with alarm. "She's vanished. I cautioned you not to secure her in her chamber." And then Eleanor's tone, not the composed, assembled timbre the girl knew, but a screech of unadulterated, undiluted ire. "The little ingrate. After everything I have accomplished for her, she will discern what insubordination means." There was the noise of a portal slamming ajar, the agitated thud of footsteps on the stairs, and then a youth's tone imploring. "I'm remorseful, Mama. Please, I'm remorseful." A keen crack like a lash or a palm striking flesh, a stifled cry, then Eleanor's tone subdued and venomous. "Remorseful is not sufficient. You are a defective, unsightly thing. I will not have a defective thing in my abode." The apparition, the recollection, whatever it was, fragmented. The noise of precipitation vanished. The sunlight re-emerged. The passage was mute again. The girl was left quivering, her palm pressed against her lips. This wasn't a narrative of a misplaced youth. This wasn't a narrative of sorrow. It was something far uglier. The recollection she had just witnessed wasn't of an abduction or a mishap in a tempest. It was the recollection of a chastisement, a ultimate, dreadful chastisement, from which the authentic Amelia had never re-emerged. Her palms shaking from the apparition in the passage, she escaped back to her chamber and tore ajar the journal, hunting for responses. She reperused the folios, her comprehension now tinted by the dreadful noises she had just heard. The remedy that made Amelia's crown full of wool, was it to render her more acquiescent, more figurine-like? The records about her mother assumed an ominous, fresh gravity. "Mama gauged me again today," she said. "I am not developing accurately. She says my grin is asymmetrical. She tugged my tresses and said it was the hue of dirt. This wasn't a mother's affection. This was an artisan's critique of a defective creation." Eleanor hadn't been bereaving an offspring. She had been enraged by a faulty commodity. Then she regarded again at the records about the phantom figure. Before she had thought it was a fancy, an apparition invented by a solitary, frightened youth. But what if it wasn't? "The phantom figure comes to my pain. He murmurs my title. He says he can convey me away." What if the phantom figure was authentic? What if he was an attendant, a compassionate caretaker? Someone Amelia had trusted to aid her evade this abode of horrors. The ultimate tear-marred record now perused like a desperate, thwarted scheme. The phantom figure is irate. "Mama discovered my covert locale. He says I have to depart tonight. He is awaiting for me by the sobbing seraphs." The sobbing seraphs, the covert locale. Mabel's terms came back to her. I knew that youth had mysteries. Amelia hadn't been claimed by a beast in the dark. She had been attempting to evade one. She had a scheme and confederate. But her mother had discovered, and the shouting the girl had heard in her apparition, it was the noise of that evasion scheme disintegrating. The verity was closing in, constricting like a snare. The authentic Amelia hadn't vanished. She had been obliterated. The apparition and the journal's affirmation of it must have altered something in her bearing. Perhaps her quiet became weightier, her eyes more discerning, because that dusk, the delicate armistice between Theodore and Eleanor, fragmented utterly. Their dispute initiated in the den below her chamber, and this time the girl pressed her ear to the planks, desperate to heed every term. "I observed you with her today." Theodore's tone was strained, fractured. "Attiring her in Amelia's garments. You are not honoring her recollection, Eleanor. You are profaning it." "Recollection?" Eleanor's chortle was a fragile, unsightly thing. "Recollection is a frailty, Theodore. It is a defect. I am not gazing backward. I am constructing forward. I am forging what should have been. Forging by tormenting a youth, by compelling her into a mold that our own offspring resisted. Do you not recollect how she detested those frocks? How she shrieked when you attempted to spiral her tresses? I recollect an insubordinate, unappreciative youth who did not value the prospects she was granted," Eleanor retorted, her tone ascending to a frenzy pitch. "I granted her everything, beauty, heritage, affluence, and she hurled it back in my face with her resistance, her flaws." There was an extended, dreadful pause. The girl suspended her respiration. Then Theodore articulated, his tone barely a murmur. "What you are doing to this fresh girl, it is what you did to her, isn't it? The sessions, the remedy, the chastisements, you are reenacting it all." And then came Eleanor's reply, and it was the most horrifying thing the girl had ever heard, because it was articulated with impeccable rational composure. "I am not reenacting it, my dear spouse. I am amending the mistakes. Amelia was a defective prototype. This one will be flawless. You were too feeble to perceive the necessity of the procedure then, and you are too feeble now. But I am not. I will not falter a second time." Reclining on the floor of her chamber, the chilling resonance of Eleanor's terms in her ears, the girl ultimately comprehended. The whole narrative, the bereaved mother, the misplaced youth, the wondrous return, was all a deception. A meticulously assembled stage drama designed to conceal a verity so monstrous it defied credence. This wasn't about sorrow. Sorrow was disordered, untidy, agonizing. Eleanor was none of those things. She was exact. She was systematic. She was an artisan, and her medium was mortal existence. The authentic Amelia hadn't been cherished. She had been possessed. She was the initial venture, a trial in crafting the impeccable noble offspring. And she had faltered. She had opposed. She had possessed a resolve of her own, a rough essence as Eleanor termed it. And for that, she had been discarded. The other girls Mabel articulated of, the one from the caravan, the one who wept too much. They were ensuing endeavors, unsuccessful trials swiftly and quietly disposed of. And now it was her turn. The voiceless girl. Eleanor must have perceived her on that platform, petite and mute and wounded, and thought, impeccable. A vacant slate, a container with no resolve of its own, no chronicle to obliterate. The quiet Eleanor's neighbors perceived as a hex, she had perceived as the ultimate merit. She wasn't attempting to compel the girl articulate. She was attempting to perfect her quiet, to shape it into the hush, exquisite obedience the authentic Amelia had declined to provide. The horror of her circumstance was total. She wasn't a substitute for a misplaced offspring. She was raw substance for a beast's masterpiece. There's a murky nook of ancestral inquiry, a murmur among chroniclers who examine the secluded potent kin of the old realm in the pre-war South. It's the notion of the mute substitute. It was never documented, of course. It was a kin mystery, a pragmatic resolution to a dreadful dilemma. In an age where lineages and legacy were everything, what did a kin do with a youth who was born erroneous? A youth with a bodily malformation, a cognitive inadequacy, or simply an essence that was too untamed, too rebellious to be governed? You couldn't just eliminate them, it would provoke an outrage. So, a narrative would be fabricated, an abrupt malady, a tragic mishap, a modest, hushed interment for a sealed coffin. The defective youth would vanish, dispatched to a remote facility, or in the murkiest rumors, merely disposed of. And then a few months or a year later, the kin would wondrously discover a substitute. And waif, a remote kin, a youth acquired under the pretense of benevolence. A youth who resembled close enough, who could be instructed and shaped and menaced into enacting the role. The neighbors would murmur, of course. They would observe that the returned youth seemed distinct, quieter, sadder, with no recollection of old companions. But no one would dare contest a potent kin. The deception would be embraced. The lineage would appear unbroken. The kin's impeccable facade would remain intact. Was Eleanor Hawthorne simply a lady driven deranged by sorrow? Or was she the practitioner of a murky, concealed custom? A custom of trimming the kin tree to ensure only the most impeccable blooms were permitted to remain. A fresh kind of determination began to form in the core of the voiceless girl. It was chill and firm as a gem. If Eleanor desired an enactment, she would receive one, but it would be on her own conditions. She couldn't combat Eleanor with might, and she had no speech to combat with terms. But she had the journal. She had the schematic of the girl she was supposed to be, and she realized she could employ it as an armament. She commenced to subtly, cleverly undermine Eleanor's venture from the interior. She initiated with the melody sessions. The journal referenced Amelia detested the harpsichord and would deliberately perform erroneous notes to exasperate her mother. So the subsequent time, Mr. Sinclair positioned her digits on the levers. The girl, who had been passively compliant before, commenced to perform jarring, discordant harmonies. Not with ire, but with a vacant figurine-like expression, as if she simply couldn't achieve it correctly. To ire in Eleanor's eyes, authentic Amelia must have perceived. During repasts, she commenced to mimic other conducts from the journal. Amelia had a habit of organizing her sustenance into peculiar patterns on her dish. The girl commenced to arrange her beans and potatoes into whorls and quadrilaterals. It was a petite mute deed of insurrection, but it was deeply disquieting to Eleanor, who yearned impeccable order. She was no longer just a voiceless container. She was actively channeling the specter of the rebellious youth Eleanor had attempted to annihilate. She was employing her quiet, her neutrality to reflect Amelia's flaws back at her creator. It was an incredibly perilous diversion. Each erroneous note on the harpsichord, each peculiarly organized dish of sustenance was a test of Eleanor's command. and the girl could sense that command commencing to unravel, the facade of the composed, systematic artisan commencing to fracture under the tension of dealing with a specter who declined to be exorcised. Eleanor, enraged by this fresh, subtle form of opposition, resolved the dilemma was not ethical, but health-related. The girl's obstinate quiet, her bursts of Amelia's rebellious conduct, must have a bodily origin, a flaw in the intellect itself. She summoned for a fresh kind of healer, a gentleman who was an ascending luminary in the peculiar and ominous realm of craniology. His title was Dr. Cornelius Hale, and he arrived with a hide case full of buffed copper gauges and intricate diagrams of the mortal cranium, which was partitioned into dozens of regions: affection, parental love, attachment, destruction. He was a gentleman who believed you could peruse a person's essence by gauging the protrusions on their crown. The scrutiny was a fresh kind of infringement. It occurred in the den with Theodore compelled to observe, his countenance pallid. Dr. Hale seated the girl in a seat and commenced his labor. His chill palms felt her scalp, his gauges clicking as he gauged every arc and depression of her cranium. "Ah, yes," he would murmur to Eleanor. "The faculty of language is underdeveloped as I surmised. A distinct hollow here." He shifted his gauges. "But the faculty of secrecy highly evident, a very substantial bulge. And here, resolve. This youth has a resolve of steel. It is a physiological flaw that is causing her resistance." Eleanor heeded, her demeanor one of grim corroboration. This discipline granted her the validation she required. The girl wasn't an individual with a chronicle of wound. She was an apparatus with fractured components. "And the remedy, doctor?" Eleanor inquired. Dr. Hale stowed his tools. "The resolve, madam, is like a sinew. A resolve that is too robust must be weakened through a routine of sensory denial, limited nourishment, and remedial water therapy." He was prescribing the vault. He was prescribing hunger. He was prescribing what they employed to term the water remedy, a form of torment that imitated submergence. He was granting Eleanor a health prescription for the very horrors she was already inflicting. Dr. Hale, for all his macabre pseudoscience, was not a simpleton. He was a gentleman who navigated courteous society, and he recognized the aroma of lunacy when he encountered it. After the scrutiny, as Eleanor was inscribing him a generous payment, he solicited a private term with Mr. Hawthorne. They stood on the porch out of Eleanor's earshot. "Your spouse," Dr. Hale initiated, selecting his terms with caution, "displays a remarkable singular concentration. Her parental devotion is quite deep." Theodore just gazed out at the marsh. His shoulders drooped. "What did you really perceive, doctor?" he inquired, his tone fatigued. Dr. Hale subdued his own tone. "I perceived a youth in a state of deep dread. And I perceived a lady who is not attempting to remedy a youth, but to construct one. This isn't remedy, Mr. Hawthorne. It is preservation. She is conserving the husk of a recollection and attempting to compel a fresh essence inside it." He paused, then seemed to render a resolution. "I have perceived this kind of fixation before. It does not conclude well. The substances, the subjects, they ultimately fracture. And when this one fractures, I dread the repercussions will be disastrous. Your spouse is not just bereaving, she is enacting deity. And she has cast herself as the luminary in a calamity of her own creation. My professional counsel, sir, as a gentleman of discipline, this enactment requires an ultimate veil before the whole platform incinerates." Theodore didn't reply. He merely stood there, an outline against the waning illumination, a gentleman who had been granted a lucid and dreadful caution. The healer's terms lingered in the moist atmosphere, an accusation and a foretelling. The abode was not an infirmary. It was a theater of savagery, and the ultimate act was swiftly approaching. The healer's visit and the menace of his prescribed remedies ignited a blaze under the girl. Time was expiring. She had to discover the covert locale Amelia inscribed about, the locale by the sobbing seraphs. She had a suspicion, a desperate aspiration, that it might contain the ultimate key to what transpired, a fragment of proof, something that could demonstrate the verity of this ordeal. Her subsequent supervised 90 minutes of liberty was her opportunity. Attired in one of Amelia's two petite frocks, she made her way into the estate's overgrown grounds. It was a locale that had once been exquisite, but was now yielding to the unyielding intrusion of the marsh. Berry shrubs grew untamed and spiny, springs were obstructed with slime, and effigies were tainted green with lichen. She hunted for seraphs. She discovered several cherubs on an avian basin, a serene guardian angel protecting an overlooked trail, but none of them were sobbing. She thrust deeper into the grounds towards the rear of the domain, where the groomed terrain dissolved into the disarray of the creek, and then she perceived it. Partially obscured by a drape of kudzu and overgrown with spiny tendrils was an old wrought metal barrier. Beyond it stood an assortment of marble memorials. It was the Hawthorne kin graveyard. She thrust through the barrier, the corroded joints moaning in objection. The atmosphere inside was chill and stagnant. There were several large, ornate headstones for Hawthorne's long deceased, and in the midst, a petite, heartbreakingly simple one. Amelia Hawthorne, cherished offspring, aged 9 years. But she wasn't regarding the graves. She was regarding the effigies that guarded the ingress to the largest edifice, a marble crypt embedded into the slope. They were two life-sized seraphs, their countenances interred in their palms, marble tears etched on their cheeks. The sobbing seraphs. This was the locale. She approached the crypt with a blend of terror and resolve. The marble was ancient, blackened with antiquity, and covered in a creeping green lichen that felt slick and vital to the contact. The two sobbing seraphs flanking the ponderous marble portal were masterpieces of grief. But as she got nearer, she perceived that their beauty was marred by something peculiar. Etched into the foundation of the effigies, partially concealed by the filth of decades, were emblems. They were not Christian emblems or scriptural verses. They were geometric, esoteric, whorls, interlocking polygons, and a recurring design that resembled an orb inside a maze. They seemed archaic, heathen, utterly misplaced in a 19th-century devout graveyard. It felt like a covert dialect, a caution that the creed practiced here was older and murkier than the one professed in the county chapel on Sundays. The ponderous metal ring on the marble portal was chill as frost. She tugged with all her might, anticipating it to be secured. But it swung inward with a subdued, grinding moan that seemed to rouse the deceased. The atmosphere that billowed out was not just stale. It was foul, dense with the scent of decay and stagnant liquid and something else. Something cloyingly sweet, like inexpensive fragrance attempting to mask a decay. It was the scent of Eleanor's chamber. The gloom inside was nearly complete, but a few slivers of illumination cut through fissures in the marble roof, illuminating a scene of deep neglect. There were several marble coffins, their lids thick with grime. But this was no hallowed resting locale. It felt like an atelier, a laboratory. Along one partition were ledges holding dusty crystal vessels, some containing desiccated plants, others unrecognizable things floating in turbid fluid. This wasn't just a sepulcher, it was a command center. It was the core of Eleanor's murky discipline. Her eyes adjusting to the dimness, she scanned the interior of the vault. It was a locale of mysteries. Amelia's journal had said, "Mama discovered my covert locale." This was it. But where had the youth concealed her own valuables? She traced her palms along the chill marble partitions, hunting for anything loose, any concealed compartment. Near the rear, behind a large coffin, she discovered it. A solitary marble block that was slightly indented. Employing all her strength, she managed to dislodge it. Inside the petite hollow was a timber container, no larger than a tome. It wasn't secured. With quivering digits, she elevated the lid. The contents made her gut churn. It wasn't an assortment of a youth's covert valuables. It was a burial ground. Lying on a bed of faded satin were 3 petite, crudely fashioned figurines made from branches and scraps of fabric. Wrapped around the neck of each figurine was a lock of tresses. One fair, one auburn, one a drab tawny. These were the other girls, the unsuccessful trials. Beneath the figurines was another smaller satin pouch. She emptied its contents into her palm. An avian's cranium, a desiccated insect, a solitary ivory fastener identical to the ones on the frock she was currently donning. And at the very base of the container, folded into a minuscule square, was a solitary folio torn from the rear of Amelia's journal. It was the authentic ultimate record, the one she had been too frightened to leave in the tome itself. She unfolded the parchment. The penmanship was an agitated, petrified scroll, barely decipherable in the dim illumination. It wasn't a scheme of evasion. It was an admission, a last will. He is not authentic. The phantom figure was a deception. I fabricated him so Mama would think someone was claiming me, so she would not know I was fleeing myself. But she knew. She always discerns. The girl's pulse hammered against her cage. The Confederate, the assistant, he had never existed. Amelia had been utterly solitary. The note persisted. She discovered my container. She discovered my evasion frock packed under the berth. She is approaching for me. She has the remedy in the silver utensil. She says it is time for my ultimate session. She says I am a defective figurine, and a figurine that cannot be mended must be returned to the container. She says the seraphs are sobbing for what she has to accomplish, but they are not. They are not sobbing, they are observing. She is conveying me to the seraphs now. I am so chill. And that was it. The note concluded there. The verity was more dreadful than she could have ever envisioned. There was no conflict, no pursuit in the tempest. Eleanor hadn't slain her offspring in a spasm of ire. It had been a composed, computed execution, a clinical method to dispose of an unsuccessful trial. Amelia had been conveyed here to this very vault, drugged with the remedy, and then returned to the container. Was she entombed in one of the coffins, interred somewhere beneath the marble floor? The girl regarded around the obscure, foul-scented sepulchre and felt the crushing gravity of its verity. This wasn't a graveyard. It was a disposal locale. Standing in the chill, obscure vault clutching the proof of Amelia's homicide and the effigies of her forgotten substitutes, the girl's realm snapped into horrifying focus. Every fragment of the conundrum fell into place. The halted timepieces in the abode frozen at the instant of Amelia's demise. Theodore's dread, the apprehension of a gentleman who knew his spouse was a slayer and was too feeble to halt her. Mabel's caution, the vanishings. She was not the initial girl to be conveyed to Hawthorne Estate to enact the role of Amelia, and she now comprehended with chilling assurance that Eleanor had never intended for any of them to depart. The venture wasn't about discovering a successful substitute. Perhaps it never was. Perhaps the venture was the procedure itself, the complete domination, the mental deconstruction, the fracturing of a mortal resolve. It was a right of command that Eleanor seemed compelled to reiterate over and over. And each time the subject faltered to achieve impeccability, the rite would conclude here in the vault. The lock of tresses would be claimed as a memento, and the girl would be stored away. She regarded at the figurines in the container, their fastener eyes gazing up at her. How long did the fair girl endure? A fortnight, Mabel had said, and the auburn who wept too much. A week, a day. She regarded down at her own obscure tresses at the ivory fasteners on her frock, and she knew she was the fourth figurine. Her time was expiring. Eleanor's forbearance was vanished. The enactment was nearing its conclusion, and when it did, a fourth effigy with a lock of obscure tresses would be added to the assortment in the container. When she emerged from the vault, blinking in the waning sunlight, she perceived Eleanor standing by the graveyard barrier, awaiting her. The descending sun encircled her crown, casting her countenance in shadow, but the girl didn't need to perceive her expression. She could sense the alteration in the atmosphere. The enactment was concluded. The facade of the bereaved, obsessive parent had not just slipped, it had been discarded. The lady awaiting her was something else entirely, chill, predatory. Her tone, when she articulated, had none of its prior melodic poise. It was flat and firm as granite. I pondered if you would be astute enough to discover it, Eleanor said, her eyes affixed on the container the girl was clutching to her chest. Amelia was astute too, in the conclusion. She advanced a step, her motion gradual and deliberate, like a cougar closing in on its quarry. You have been a letdown, you know. I had such elevated aspirations for you, the quiet. I thought it was an indication of a pure vacant container, but you are just as rebellious as she was, just as defective. The pretense was vanished. The whole elaborate stage drama had collapsed, and now there were just the two of them in the overgrown garden of the deceased. There was no discourse of sessions, no reference of recollection. There was solely a chilling practical conclusiveness in Eleanor's tone. It appears this trial too has reached its termination. Grant me the container. It is time to return things back where they pertain. She extended a gloved palm, not in solicitation, but in directive. The girl didn't shift. She just stood there clutching the container. Her quiet no longer a barrier of wound, but a mute resounding denial. And in that instant of resistance, the specter of Amelia and the essences of the other misplaced girls seemed to stand with her. Abruptly, a tone cut through the strained confrontation. Eleanor, halt! It was Theodore. He came stumbling through the grounds, his countenance pallid and slick with perspiration, his eyes untamed with a desperation that had ultimately boiled over into valor. In his palm, he clutched a long-barreled hunting rifle. Dr. Hale's caution must have ultimately penetrated his barrier of petrified indifference, or perhaps he had perceived Eleanor follow the girl to the graveyard and knew what was about to transpire. He was quivering, but his tone was firm. It is concluded. This lunacy. It ends this evening. Eleanor pivoted to him, her expression not of apprehension, but of deep, dismissive disdain. You, she sneered. You are going to halt me. The gentleman who stood by and observed? The gentleman who permitted me to secure our offspring in her chamber for spilling pigment on a carpet? Your palms are just as tainted as mine, my dear spouse. You are a poltroon. I was, Theodore said, his tone cracking, but he elevated the rifle, aiming it at his spouse with a quivering palm. But I will not be an accomplice to another homicide. Not again. He regarded the girl. Flee, he choked out. Depart from here. Proceed. For an instant no one shifted. The scene was frozen. The monstrous spouse, the fractured spouse, and the voiceless youth clutching the proof of all their transgressions. The girl knew this was her sole opportunity. She didn't know if Theodore would actually discharge the weapon, but his intervention had generated the disarray she required. She locked eyes with him for a split instant, a mute acknowledgement of his belated, desperate deed of atonement. Then, clutching the container, she pivoted and fled. Not towards the abode, but towards the marsh. Towards the untamed, obscure unknown. She fled with a desperation she had never known, the spiny tendrils of the grounds tearing at Amelia's satin frock, ripping it to tatters. She could hear shouting behind her, Theodore imploring, Eleanor shrieking in unadulterated animalistic ire. Then the keen, deafening crack of the rifle discharge echoed through the dusk. The girl didn't dare regard back. She didn't know who had been struck, who had endured. She solely knew she had to persist moving. She plunged into the fringe of the marsh, the groomed terrain of the estate yielding to sucking mire and brackish liquid. The atmosphere grew dense and ponderous, vital with the hum of pests and the guttural croak of toads. The oak trees ascended around her like the pillars of a vast submerged sanctuary, their limbs dripping with kudzu. It was a horrifying, disorienting realm, but it was superior to the chill, ordered horror of the estate. She scrambled over toppled trunks, her feet sinking into the murky liquid, the container held high to keep it arid. And then she heard it, a noise that chilled her to the marrow, the noise of someone else crashing through the foliage behind her, gaining on her. It was Eleanor. She must have evaded Theodore. The lady's ire seemed to grant her an unnatural velocity and vigor. You cannot conceal from me. Eleanor's tone screamed from the dimness, no longer mortal, but a raw, ragged noise of unadulterated hatred. You are mine. You are my creation. I will not permit you evade. The pursuit was an ordeal. The descending sun cast the marsh in a crimson illumination. The girl was petite and nimble, but Eleanor was unyielding, a force of nature propelled by a lunacy that knew no weariness. The girl could hear her ragged respiration getting nearer, could hear the snap of branches under her feet. There was nowhere to proceed, nowhere to conceal. The marsh was interminable, and Eleanor would not halt until she had her possession back. The girl burst into a petite clearing, her lungs scorching, her limbs quivering with exhaustion. Her trail was obstructed by a deep ebony pool of stagnant liquid, a creek that was too broad to traverse. She was ensnared. She pivoted her back to the liquid and confronted her pursuer. Eleanor emerged from the trees, her fine frock torn and smeared with mire, her meticulously styled tresses a untamed tangle. In her palm, she clutched a long, wicked-appearing shard of crystal torn from a fractured greenhouse in the grounds. Her eyes were utterly deranged. "There you are," she hissed, respiring heavily. "The ultimate session. A figurine that flees must have its limbs fractured so it can be positioned back on the ledge permanently." As Eleanor advanced, another silhouette stumbled into the clearing. It was Theodore. He was clutching his arm, an obscure stain spreading across his ivory shirt, but he was vital. The rifle was vanished. "Eleanor, for the affection of deity," he pleaded, his tone feeble. "Permit the youth depart. It's concluded." "It is concluded when I declare it is," she shrieked, barely glancing at him. She lunged at the girl. At that instant, something inside the girl, some primal instinct for endurance, ultimately penetrated the years of quiet. As Eleanor swung the shard of crystal, the girl emitted a noise. It was not a term. It was a raw, guttural shriek full of all the dread and ire she had contained inside for years. And with the shriek, she hurled the container, Amelia's container with the figurines and the note, directly at Eleanor's countenance. The container struck Eleanor on the brow. She staggered back, more from astonishment than the force of the impact, her foot landing on a patch of slick, moist lichen at the liquid's edge. Her limbs flailed, hunting for equilibrium, and then, with an ultimate startled cry, she fell backward into the deep ebony liquid of the creek. She surfaced once, her eyes broad with shock, and then the obscure, murky liquid closed over her crown. A stream of bubbles ascended to the surface, and then nothing. The marsh had claimed her. The quiet that descended over the clearing was more deep than any the girl had ever known. The hum of the pests, the chirping of the toads, it all seemed to surge back in to fill the emptiness left by Eleanor's violent conclusion. Theodore gazed at the locale where his spouse had vanished, his countenance a facade of shock and a dawning, dreadful relief. He slid to his knees in the mire, his wounded arm forgotten, and commenced to sob, great wrenching noises of a gentleman whose essence had ultimately fractured free from a long and dreadful captivity. The girl stood by the liquid's edge, quivering, clutching the ripped remnants of Amelia's frock. She observed the ebony liquid for an elongated time, half anticipating Eleanor's pallid, furious countenance to ascend from the depths, but it never did. The marsh had claimed its toll. As twilight ultimately merged into authentic dark, Theodore eventually assembled himself. He regarded the girl, his eyes full of a grief and shame so deep it was challenging to meet his stare. He didn't attempt to contact her. He didn't attempt to compel her return to the abode. He simply nodded, a gesture of liberation. "Depart," he murmured. "The realm will think the marsh claimed you, too. It is superior that way. Be liberated of this locale. Be liberated of us." He pivoted and staggered back the way he came, a specter returning to his spectral abode, leaving the girl solitary at the fringe of the wilderness. She did not know where she would proceed or what she would accomplish. But as she pivoted her back on Hawthorne Estate and ambled away into the Georgia dark, she felt not apprehension, but a peculiar, horrifying, and exhilarating sense of tranquility. The enactment was concluded, the figurine was fractured, and the girl was, for the initial time in a very long time, simply herself. The narrative of Hawthorne Estate became another regional legend, a specter narrative narrated to frighten youths. The formal chronicle states that Eleanor Hawthorne, distraught with renewed sorrow, wandered into the marsh and was misplaced, and that the peculiar mute waif she had adopted suffered the same destiny days later. Theodore Hawthorne endured out his days as a hermit, vending off his terrain fragment by fragment, permitting the estate to fall into decay until it was ultimately consumed by the very marsh that bordered it. He never articulated of his spouse or offspring again. The vault with its mysteries was engulfed by the soil, forgotten. But the girl endured. She ambled for 3 days, subsisting on wild nuts until she was discovered by a benevolent barren fishing duo who adopted her in. They didn't inquire about her chronicle. They perceived the spectral look in her eyes and simply granted her a domicile. For a long time, she remained mute. The custom of it was too deep, the recollections too raw. But one day, months later, her fresh mother was humming a simple folk melody, and the girl discovered herself humming along. The noise surprised them both. Gradually, painstakingly, she commenced to articulate again, acquiring to employ a speech she had long since forgotten. And the very initial term she chose to articulate aloud, the initial title she claimed for herself, was not the title she was born with, nor the title of the specter she was compelled to become. It was a fresh title, a title of her own selecting. It was a hushed testament to her endurance, an ultimate exorcism of the specters of Hawthorne Estate. This wasn't just a tale of a lost child or a grieving mother. It was a chilling exposé of control's seductive grip, a warning of what happens when the human heart twists love into ownership. Eleanor's tools weren't claws or fangs, but the cold, calculated cruelties of her time, cloaked in the guise of science and righteousness. What do you think? Did Eleanor's madness stem from personal grief, or was she part of a darker, older tradition hidden in the shadows of the Hawthorne bloodline? Drop your theories in the comments. We read every single one. If this story gripped you, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more forgotten histories that'll keep you up at night. Share this with a friend who loves peeling back the layers of the past, because the truth is often scarier than any ghost. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next dark corner of history.